Thank you all for joining us here at the New Haven Museum. We couldn't welcome you in person, but we're happy to talk factory and everything that's kind of gone on this year. So we'll go around. I'm Khalil Kotap. I'm the education director here at the museum. And let's just go around and introduce ourselves.
I'm Jason Bischoff-Wurstle, the director of photo archives here at the New Haven Museum and the curator of the exhibit Factory.
I'm Gorman Bechard. I am the director of the documentary that's being made on the New Haven Clock Company's building, which is also called Factory.
I'm Bill Kraus. I specialize in redeveloping historic buildings, and I've been working to preserve and restore the clock factory for about 20 years, and then gathered a lot of this information and working with Gorman as producer, and work with both Gorman and Jason on the exhibition.
So, I mean, the first question is how has this year been looking at the project? For any of you that want to jump in and talk about it, because we opened the exhibit, I think it was mid-January, Jason, and
February 20th.
February 20th. And for me, it was one of the biggest things that I was part of here at the museum in the 3 years going on 3 years I've been here. It was just packed. Like, people just kept flowing in and flowing in and flowing in. And it was just such a lively party atmosphere, so much fun, and everybody was kind of enjoying themselves in such a diverse crowd. And then a month later, almost to the day, I think, within like a week or so, our museum closed. So I think, and Jason, you've been working on this for a while. So what was it like to kind of see all that work kind of get hidden away for a while?
To think about it, it's still here. It's still up. I think I never really felt any sort of sense of necessarily disappointment because, for one, the show was done. If the show hadn't opened on the 20th and it was delayed 3 weeks, it wouldn't have opened, and that would be a bummer because then no one would have seen it. The opening, when you sit back and you think about it now, it's extraordinary because now we know that COVID was around. I don't know if it was necessarily here in New Haven at that point, but this was a gathering of over 300 people. So, that's just almost like we're 5 years ago now, I feel like, in our head, or at least my head. But, I've never felt like a really large sense of disappointment because it's there. It's just kind of something that's on ice. It's kind of just contained. People have been able to see it when we were open to the general public on a reservation basis. But, at the same time, again, we've been creating programming and creating different ways of seeing it. So I think it just falls in with the overall theme of 2020, which is, things are different.
Mm-hmm. Gorman, Bill?
For me, I had started working on the film with Bill probably at least a year and a half before that. I mean, documentaries take a long time just to find people and get them to talk. I've been in the arts since, my God, 1983, and I've never been involved with a museum show. So for me, this was honestly it was a thrill. It was an honor. And then, yes, it's like, just everything closed down, but I guess for me, that was my whole life. I mean, we had 2 big films that were coming out this year. We had all these screenings planned. I was going on tour with my pizza movie, Pizza Love Story. Everything just, got canceled. And I mean, for me, it was just, I don't want to say icing on the cake, the opposite of icing on the cake,
The
crap on the crap, for a year that where it's just like, everything just went into the toilet this year. And, it was a very depressing year, which I'm sure for everyone it was, just trying to deal with, you know, how we were living, you know. So yeah, for me, it was like we had this crazy, wonderful show, but you couldn't send people to see it, you know. And I mean, we did Jason and I worked on those little videos, which I think, you know, give you a sense of the show, but still, it's like when you're there, like my wife finally came to see it at one of the appointments because she couldn't make the opening night. And when she saw it in person, she just felt it was just that much cooler than seeing the videos.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that in and of itself is the issue of the physical versus the virtual, and that's definitely something that I've been grappling with this year, and then moving forward too. Is kind of this idea with future exhibit planning. I'm currently dealing with this idea of, you know, how do you deal with something that is physical by nature, that is location based by nature, and then, you know, make it so you can so people can experience it. And especially an exhibit like this that was very by design, it's designed to emulate the feeling of that factory. So yes, it's very, if you look at it from that perspective, it is, yeah, it's just kind of yeah, it's strange because you just can't, you don't have that tactile feeling. But
right. I was going to say it's the same thing like seeing a picture of Starry Night by Van Gogh and then standing in front of Starry Night by Van Gogh, and it's like there's no, you can't even put those two, you can't compare those two. It's just, yeah, it seems,
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yes.
But I know exactly what you mean. You know, I remember that happened actually. I remember it was on display at the Yale Art Gallery.
Yes.
Yes. You know, I don't know how many years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe now. And yeah, I remember I stopped by and looked at it and I'm like, I've seen this thing my entire life, but wow, you know, right. And it's like that with any kind of, you know, art, you know, especially paintings, I feel like often, where you get the texture, you get the feeling. And that's really, you know, the nature of the business, I feel like at a core of producing exhibits is, you're actually seeing this thing. You're supposed to be, we're exhibiting these objects, these ideas. So yeah, it is something where by nature, it was not this exhibit. And then, you know, the idea of exhibitions in general for museums, it's not really a museum or rather a video experience. And then kind of translating that. But at the same time, I also feel like this is like, it's like anything else right now. It's fast forwarding to where we're going to need to be in society anyway. It's almost kind of like giving in. It's like, yeah, people do consume everything on their phones right now. They consume everything on screens.
Unfortunately, though, you can't get the idea of the brick and wood wall, you know, which is wonderful and colorful and massive. That just doesn't translate on your phone.
No. And, you know, I mean, we can talk more about the clips for sure, Factory Weekly, but that was the root of, you know, starting that project as well, is really to try to express this feeling of the show, put you back inside, because again, the show is designed, you know, to again, convey these stories, the memories, collect memories, but yeah, kind of put you in a place like, and that was something I struggled with and worked towards, because as Bill will attest to, the factory building itself, the clock factory, is a very singular place. You know where you are when you're in it. Well, you might not know, you might get lost. But you know, that thing in prepping to do the show, it was always just like, how do I replicate this place, you know, and replicate it in a museum setting, which I'm sure Bill can speak to, you know, the building itself.
Yeah, well, for me, you know, the show was amazing. The opening was amazing. You know, having worked to save this building and gather all these stories and meet all the people behind the stories and research all the stuff behind the stories. It's been, you know, just fantastic to, you know, work with you, Jason, and you, Gorman, and have your creativity work with all this massive stuff, that is fun to talk about, but it's sort of like, how do you present this to other people? I've taken maybe 100 people on or more on tours through the building, and would recount these stories in the different spaces as we went through them, and it was fantastic. But how do you put this into a exhibition? How do you put this into a movie? It's beyond me, but you guys have done just an amazing job, and beyond what I could have imagined, And I just thought, the exhibition was like a great creative reinterpretation. You did your own research with these people, and brought your own, sensibility to it. And I thought did a fantastic job of recreating the feeling of the building and the stories. And absolutely the same with Gorman, cinematically. So, it's been thrilling for me to be involved with you guys.
Thank you. And something we should point out is the idea too of the projects themselves, because they are, I've always viewed them as kind of, they're three spokes, I guess. There's the film, there's the preservation of the building itself, and of which the projects were born out of, meaning the film and the exhibit. But each one takes on, it's part of the whole in the end, but it takes on its own life and its own form. And that too was a challenge in putting together the end result of an exhibit, because it needed to take on its own life. A lot of the photos and the research and the people involved in the characters do and can and will show up in the film. And, Bill's spoken about them in the tours, and you can see it in the building itself. But then it's like, how does that blend into what would form an exhibit? So, that too has always been, that was an interesting part of putting together the show, is that each piece stands independently. It's not independently, but as a whole, and not dependent on having to go on a tour, even though the tours are delightful, or dependent on having to see the film. But then when you hopefully, see all of it together and then go to the building itself, you get a sense of all of it, because also there's so much more to each project itself. There's so much more to the building's history. In the final edition of the exhibit, for instance, it was a very conscious choice to not really go back in time so much. And Bill, you and I discussed, we discussed for like months just the back history. We got into that. We had these meetings, in your trailer on site, kind of like, really diving into the layers. And almost I came to view that almost as like that could be a prequel to this entire show, because the history there was so in depth. So when you're dealing with this physical building and part of the physical landscape, just peeling back these layers of history throughout time and then picking which layers is what each project, I think, in this particular kind of area really it makes them individual, I guess.
It's also, who is the stories in the building are involving people, but it's also like, are we really telling a certain person's story, or are we really telling their story through the building's eyes? So it's always still like rooted in the building. I think that's one of the big things. Like when I'm putting the film together, I'm very specifically not going into anything that has to do, it's not part of the building proper, because you might have had a great story at the building, but what you did before and after you left it, all of us, it's almost like It's almost like a Louis Buñuel film, that all of a sudden, once someone left the screen, we no longer followed them and we followed the object instead. And that was the more important thing. It wasn't about the people. It was about the people's relationship to that object. In this case, the object, of course, being the building. And yeah, I mean, the early history, which will be focused on in the film as well, the clock history with Chauncey Jerome is astounding. And you could do another show on that, between him, his relationship with P.T. Barnum, and so forth and so on.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, the whole, it's very interesting, the industrial history, et cetera. I mean, at one point it being the worldwide leader in mass-produced clocks, et cetera. And, the fact that working in New Haven history, I get to say that often about a lot of places. It's like, this place was, the place in the world for 2 years or for a year, which is exceptional into its own right. But it was really the relationships, and it sets the tone of that building, and there is a through line that goes through its history. And then, that's something you come to understand more and more. And it's that feeling. And that was part of, again, what brought me into the project, what really something I wanted to convey, because I do think about this often, is, each building, even say your house conveys your life story. You lived in that house, but before you, chances are, at least in Connecticut, someone else lived in that house. And think of all their experiences. And these things do leave marks, and sometimes physical marks, but often just, what they see, what the walls can see. And you definitely get that sense when you're in the clock company or factory building, to this day. You get a sense that, life has been lived in that building.
Yeah, a lot of life. I mean, the building has, 175 years of history, and it's this multi-layered, incredibly diverse history that just makes it amazing. A lot of, I work with historic buildings, and I'm always looking for, something interesting, fun, something that'll spark your imagination about them, to help promote the project, and just because it's fascinating. But this one, has, for me, a through line. It has this, grand industrial history with major inventors, major captains of industry, thousands of factory workers, the center of a thriving immigrant community of Polish, Irish, then Italian. And then in the post-industrial era, it became this magnet for artists, underground activities, music, underground activities, illegal activities. It's almost like this kaleidoscopic, thing. But for me, a through line is, through all of it, is this creative energy. So like, in the industrial time, the inventor time, a lot of, they made millions of clocks a year. They revolutionized the industry. And then post-industrial, you had, in the wreckage, the ruins of this industrial complex, you had lots of cheap space, and you had a landlord who was, open, I guess, attracted to, different kind of people. And he let them run wild, for no rent or very low rent. And they're, and so you had Dmitri, the head of this mime troupe, creating a little artist colony there. And, just by, when the landlord, Tony, said, you can have this space, he's like, okay, go and talk to Goody's, the lawnmower repair guy downstairs. He'll show you how to run the electric and run the gas lines and the plumbing. and they just scarfed together things and made beautiful lofts. Or, you know, the Badass White Boys Motorcycle Club, you know, like boarded up interior, you couldn't see in, but they had this really elaborate clubhouse, you know, with weights and bars and amazing, you know, graffiti decorations in their lounge, or brick and wood, you know, low budget, but got great acts, whether they be the during the R&B period, where you had Marion Meadows, Run DMC, Boys to Men, or the hardcore punk scene, which is the wall display that Gorman was just talking about, where you had Guar, and
G.G. Allen.
G.G. Allen, of course, Mick Ronson, you know, somebody, you know, Deborah Lyle from Romeo Void, and Jim Carroll, the you know, punk poet. And you had people like Cornel West and Bell Hooks going to the R&B brick and wood because it was a great place to dance, and that was part of their creative collaboration when they were writing Breaking Bread together. So, and then you have the Yale art students having the, you know, the sex ball, which was like one of the greatest every time I would talk to somebody who went there, they would sort of spontaneously say, it was the best party I've ever been to in my life. And so it's this kind of cross section of New Haven's society from low to high, insider to outsider.
Yeah.
And it's just, you know, so it you know, it's like, how do you do justice to this? And I think, you know, Jason and Gorman have done it and are doing it.
It's something where, you know, you have a couple points there that, you know, another couple through lines that go through, or one, at least from my outlook, everyone I talk to associated with that place will say pretty much universally it was the time of their life. It may have been a time of their life they didn't want to, you know, live for another 10 years. It may have been a week in their life that was the best week, or it may have been a 2-year period or what have you. But it was that moment where I feel like, and you see it time and time again, it was that moment where that, you know, unlimited kind of freedom, cheap rent, kind of social movements, economics, everything always sort of came together time and time again, and people just had that oomph that then took them through to the next stage of their lives. But people did leave that place and went on to its next stage, and the building goes on to its next stage. And I think also another through line in it too is that we as a society and as a city have definitely all have moved to that next stage too. And be it, you know, the show ends around 2000, and, you know, you can even see it this year. This year, again, I'm saying we're pushing things forward really fast, but you see it, you know, very much that the city, basically you can't have a space like that anymore. And that was part of the show too, is this sort of, you know, an homage, if you will, to that. I wouldn't say the romanticism of it, because I kind of wanted to downplay the romanticism of, you know, the grungy, you know, arts factory, but at the same time, it was romantic, if that makes any sense. You know, it's that period where it was, but it, you know, also in the same breath, people will say like, oh yeah, no, but it also had holes in the roof, and I never would want to go back to that again, or there were rats, or, you know, this was super sketchy. So, but that's a really, in putting the project together, that was a really great perspective that I heard unsolicited to each person I spoke to.
Yeah, absolutely. It was amazing to find these people. So what happened, I was working, you know, with the building, you know, on and off for the first 10 years, and going through it, you know, the first time you go through it, or the first time I saw it, you know, it was just like, oh my God, you know, this is like, you know, just like this amazing, massive, thing. And I love historic buildings, and this one was like amazing to me. But then going through it, you see, and I can you get a feeling, of the history just by walking into it. But then, I'd see these things or hear some vague stories. You'd see this, like these murals of neoclassical hermaphrodites painted on the boarded up windows, they're pretty good. And, or, the remains of somebody's loft or the remains of the old president's office. And like some of these things, like the president's office, okay, you could figure out, okay, that must have been it. But like, what were these murals and what was this, or what were these little artifacts, and the old owner had died. I had met him in 2000, and he was a really interesting guy, but we were going to work together, but didn't go through. And then when he died, his kids contacted me, and the kids didn't really know too much of the detail behind these stories. And so eventually I started, with like hardly any information, tracking people down. And then when I would meet somebody, the first person I met was Dimitri, the mime. And this whole worlds would kind of open up. They'd start, explaining what these things were. And they would have, and as Jason said, there would be like the times of their lives. And they would be sharing, photos and videos and just their stories. And these whole worlds would open up and it'd become even more fascinating. So it was like, okay, well, let's try to find the next person and the next thing. And some of them were very hard to dig up.
Some people were still digging up.
Exactly. Well, yeah, literally digging. But yeah, there's still, there, as Jason was alluding to, there are literally thousands and thousands of people that have some relationship to the building. And there were, 2,000 people at a time that worked in the building. But then, thousands of people that went to, Brick and Wood or Kurtz or Club International or the other strip clubs. And then people that went to, art exhibits and so on. So it's like you throw a stone and you find somebody that you hit somebody that has a connection to the building. And primarily, as Jason says, they were very good experiences people had and very memorable. I remember the first story I ever heard about the building was before I ever met the building. So Bitsy Clark, the longtime head of the Arts Council, met with me when I was looking for a spot to create artist live work housing, which I ultimately did in downtown Bridgeport at the Reed's building. And she said, oh, the clock, you've got to look at the clock factory. You got to go meet Tony Yangavane. He's, very friendly. And she told me this story about this art exhibit, this 1984, the 1984 art exhibit. And, she tells a great story. And she was saying that, basically what happened was the access was limited because of by the fire marshal, and it was this one day event and very avant-garde, far out kind of art, and people started lining up to get in the building, and the more people lined up, the more people thought it was great, and they lined up. So then this like line around the block. And the artists had a great response, which was, they sent people out to, to sing and dance, and they passed out hors d'oeuvres while people were waiting. And it was this amazing thing that people, continued to talk about. And that was sort of the first story. But then, I heard other stories, a lot of similar things, sort of like, oh, the Brick and Wood, lines around the block, for the R&B time. You had to be, good looking or know somebody to get in. Brick and Wood hardcore punk scene, also some of those shows, lines around the block. The first strip club there, Club International, with the glass swimming pool hanging from the ceiling, packed lines around, and all these things sort of it burned brightly, but for a short time, for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And but there was this energy around it, these things, that was really remarkable, and creativity on a low budget.
You think that had anything to do with the building is sort of, so to speak, on the other side of the tracks, which nowadays means on the other side of the highway, but you could be almost anonymous in this building, where if you're like going to a club downtown, everyone sees you, you walk out, everyone knows you. Here, you walk out, you're in a dark, potentially, back then especially, potentially dangerous street.
Oh yeah, totally. It absolutely was dangerous. And I think that's, to some degree, these kind of, offbeat underground things are the only thing that would go to the building. Those kind of uses were the only things that were available. Certainly without a lot of investment in renovating the building, which wasn't, in the cards at that time. But I asked, one of Tony's kids once, why do you think all these things happened here? And, part of it is that it has this, acre courtyard in the middle of it that you have to enter by going into this underpass. And up until, 2004 or so, it was an enclosed square. The city made them tear down the back wing, so it's now a U. But you would go in there and you'd be like in another world. And it was kind of like, what goes on in the clock factory stays in the clock factory.
Right.
You go in under the underpass, and all the activities, going in and out of the building, are hidden.
Yeah.
So it's not only on the other side of the highway, but it's also, you're within this enclave.
Yeah. I mean, we've alluded to the fact that it's essentially a castle. I mean, it's a 19th century castle. Like they literally cannot construct buildings that same way anymore under current standards. And so you have this like abandoned castle essentially. And also, I don't think we've even mentioned its proper location, just for our viewers. It's on Hamilton Street. I believe the address is still 133, correct?
Yeah.
So located on Hamilton Street, just near the intersection with Grand Avenue, and on that east side of Interstate 91. And so, yes, this being on the other side of 91 too is very integral into this underground history, into really just why it's there, and that ties into so much of New Haven's own history, our own industrial history, or very much our own post-industrial history, which gets addressed into the show. But yeah, it's this idea you can find these spaces in a time when you could find these spaces that existed and were pretty much almost like a no man's land, and you could have this freedom, and you still have that, but that's something that's fleeting away rapidly, at least in cities. And you still have more space clearly outside of cities, but cities are becoming, I believe, in the 20s here, the 2020s, they're becoming a little more curated, or they're going to head towards a certain pattern of being a little more curated by activity and design. And this place was just an overall, as long as you had your $200 a month basically for Tony, it's like kind of no questions asked.
And even if you didn't, occasionally.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the building was originally part of Worcester Square. And so urban renewal, divided it from Worcester Square with this raised highway, and the highway was raised intentionally to create a separation between the residential, what they were going to leave as the residential side, and what they were going to do as this urban, this new industrial park, basically.
Remember originally, the highway was going through Worcester Square.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would have just, Worcester Square only survived because of the two pizza places.
Yeah. Yeah, and the idea,
and the Geloro family,
and a coalition of neighbors, and kind of a complex story of mortgages, redlining, etc., which that also shows why this building lasted, because it's the last of its kind too there. There's only a few other of these buildings that are there, and these are just traces of an entire neighborhood that was decimated in 10 years. Like 10 years gone, and then you just have this castle left, and all the lives that were connected, all the stores, the churches, the generations of people gone. You know, somewhere might still be kind of around, but for the most part, you know, their entire neighborhoods were wiped out, taken away, and they moved to the suburbs, moved to a different place in town, and this place still stood, and it's still standing today. You know, and these are the kind of places we take for granted often too, which is, you know, as I say in the exhibit, when you walk in, there's one of these in every town, but we don't really think about it, at least in New England for sure. There's like an old weird factory that's like hidden behind some bushes, and you know, you might see a light on it once in a while, and you often, the general public doesn't give much of a thought to what goes on in there, what happened in there, and what continues to go on. And especially in the case of this place, so much went on, and it remained, you know, hidden in plain view, as we've been saying. And that's been, you know, part of this, and that's been the core of this entire story.
That's what drew me to the movie, where I wanted to do, because there is one of these buildings in every city, especially like you said, especially in New England, but everywhere. I mean, you go to Minneapolis, you go to, I've been all over the country, and you still find these old buildings that most people look at as an eyesore. It's all boarded up. Why hasn't this been torn down? And I wanted to show that building in your town really does have a life. And you know, it's almost like a living, breathing thing. And if you just look into it, it's got a crazy history that's probably more interesting than almost any other building around it.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and that's the case with this, and that's something we tried to do in the exhibit too. And that was part of the fun of it, was then digging back those layers and actually even finding the reason. You know, for instance, why was this one building left? You know, and try to convey that feeling to people, because even today, when you go over there, yeah, it's on the other side of the highway, it's on the other side of the tracks, what have you, and it adds to the fact, you know, New Haven's a peculiar place. Let's be honest. You know, I've been to a lot of places. I love living here, no doubt. I love working here and working in its history, but it is a very, when you sit back and look at it, peculiar place. And peculiar partially by its own design, especially for people that just first arrive here. And like the factory is located in this area that's all just like flat, wide open parking lots and kind of like low warehouse buildings. And in the middle, you're a mile away from downtown, and you know, you have a beautiful river a mile in the other direction leading into, you know, this whole other neighborhood. So you don't quite get a sense of it. And through this building, where we were able to kind of convey that story as well and tell the story, because it is a monument to, it's something that straddles, you know, not just generations of people, but different eras of the city in general, you know, the community in general. Be it, and highbrow, lowbrow, everything in between.
And then,
it's an amazing.
I was going to say, a question I come up is, you know, when Jason, looking at how you guys set up upstairs and trying to recreate that feeling, is picking those stories. And it's interesting to see Gorman talking about the history of it and going to the beginnings of it. And we see that in the exhibit, but I feel the more modern take on it, on all the clubs and things that were in there. And I guess I would ask is how do you balance that? Like, Jason, how did you balance picking out, you know, the historical piece of it, which, I mean, from my perspective, it's always the stories, the personal stories that really engage people, because you get emotionally invested. And a lot of times history is told very coldly. And it's like, this happened here and this happened here. So it was really interesting. You get this emotion walking into that space, or you get these moments of brightness, especially that wall. So, I mean, I would want to know a little more about, like, how did you, and how does that differ for where Gorman was going with the documentary?
I mean, I think, like, that it's just that it was really, the deeper you get into the story, you see that each segment is a world unto itself, but they were all connected by the place, by the building, and each thing has, like, its own personal touch, its own humanity to it. And this is, again, something that would commonly be disregarded, and disregarded kind of, like, by mainstream standards, disregarded even in a standard kind of history museum. And to me, it's not disregarded. To me, I've hung out in these places, all right? Like, I've gone to these shows. Like, I may not do that every day now. But again, see, I've moved on to a different place in my life, like other people there. But, I'm interested in these areas. And so, it was really, I wouldn't even say so much of a challenge, but an honor and, I wouldn't phrase it necessarily duty, but definitely felt a weight to tell people's stories correctly, honestly, and respectfully, and then also be able to give that to the viewer. The selection process of doing it was really, it came down to, often when it was boiled down to, this show was really heavy in editing. It was because there's so much material, so many stories, and the physical restrictions of the actual galleries helped set how the story was going to play itself out. And so basically, I made a rule to almost follow, say, you get a quick back history, but then we really get into why is the building there to solve this, the redevelopment era. So it basically picks up in 1960 with the closing of the clock factory. It gives you the whys, and then we go to the late 70s and 80s, and we end up around 2000. And so there was also a conscious decision of ending around that point, because for one, ran out of space, and then two, in working with history and working with kind of more recent things, and that's what this would be considered. And also, this was also sort of a thing, like when I started here about 13, 14 years ago, I was going through our collections and I'm like, hey, there's not a lot from the 80s in here. There's nothing from the 90s really in here. Like, where is this stuff? And I was told, that's not history. That just happened. I'm like, but that's history to me. That's history to other people. That's history, and so it's a perspective of what is history. And that's what this show really, I wanted to really get that chance to document it. However, 20 years ago, it's not that long ago. So it was a good place to stop, because there are things where, we're, as I mentioned, there's still things we're finding out. So, we could have put a story in, and all of a sudden tomorrow there's a whole new component to that story, or, something else pops up information wise. It was also a point too, where if you look at the chronology of the building and its history, it kind of, and Bill, I'm sure you could, support this idea. It's, as we've discussed this, it's kind of where the downslide kind of, it went from the more of a creative peak to kind of more, you could justify as being a little seedier, a little more, there's a little more dark undercurrents, let's put it that way, to it. And, again, it felt like a good place to kind of leave it, just kind of based on that as well. But yeah, that in making those conscious decisions, because there's a lot of outtakes. Let's put it that way. There's a lot of things that didn't make it into the show. I mean, we skipped Michael Bolton, for instance. You know, like he didn't even make it into the show. But
he's still mad at you about that.
I know. You know, maybe
he's been texting me.
Yeah, you know, contact me on this one. You know.
Yeah. I think in terms of for the film, it's a little different. When you make a documentary, the thing I love about a documentary is you don't go in with a script, because you go in with what you need to find people. You never know what they're going to say. They're going to dictate your story once you get into the editing room. That's where you sort of write your script. So for me, a lot of this has been, who can we get in touch with? Who can we interview? Like there was a country western bar at that place at one point, which no one talks about because we cannot find anyone to talk about it. I would love to include that in the film.
Right.
If anyone's listening from Country Palace, contact us.
Yeah. The Badass White Boys Motorcycle Club, they're going to be talked about a little bit, but I would actually love for one of the guys from the club to, you know, come and talk to us. Yeah. We have I mean, when you talk about like editing, the first cut, because we're editing film now, the first cut of the Chauncey Jerome history, which really only goes up until Chauncey Jerome dies in the late 1800s, was 2 hours long. Right. That had to be brought down to under 10 minutes, because that's not what the film, and even that is going to be cut into the film, because I don't want to basically give you all of that history in one big gulp. You'll be turning away. You know, it's also with a film, you have to like make it entertaining. There's a great Michael Moore quote, which I think is the best thing he's ever said about filmmaking, which is, don't make documentaries, make movies. And that, I really try to live by that you don't want to be preaching to somebody. You want to entertain them and hopefully to get a little bit of education out of it in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have kind of a similar outlook with exhibits as well. I know what I don't like in exhibits, and the list is fairly long, but I also know what I do enjoy and kind of what I try to place in there, and especially in an exhibit like this, but in general, in what we do here at the museum, because we are the Museum of New Haven, and New Haven is a small, it's a small town in relative sense. So, we're telling the stories of people, of this town, and we can't afford to give it a personal touch. We can't afford to do that, and people connect, and that's the whole core of it. That kind of keeps the whole wheel turning, because if somebody comes in and they connect to that, they're going to feel comfortable and tell us more. They might tell us one of the stories that didn't pop up, and so then that gets added to the recording of history, the canon of history. And that's one thing I wanted to, and I'm always desiring of, but I really wanted to play with this show, was what is the canon, and saying that the canon, whatever we subscribe to, it's not what you're taught in school, as far as that goes. Another point you were making, though, is, in selecting what went into the show, a lot of it was really being able to find those people and go back and talk to those people. So, like, you, Bill, have spoke to most of these people. Gorman has now met most of these people. I then went and spoke to people, and it was actually being able to find them and do that, because I didn't want to take on something that I didn't know. If I didn't have a conversation with you, I can't put your story necessarily on the wall. I can't document that and feel responsible doing so, especially because it only happened, say, 30 years ago. In doing exhibits often in this place, frankly, people are dead. So time has passed that you can interpret, their lives. You can say, okay, here, this happened, this makes a logical conclusion, et cetera, et cetera. In this instance, many of the people are still alive. They've just gone on to different things. That created a whole different challenge that did weigh really heavily in the actual piecing together of this show. and then, you know, kind of conveying ultimately to whatever the best material, that we had. If there's stuff where there's great stories, but I did not have an object. I did not even have one photo to really go with it. And so it got cut. Doesn't mean it was in any way less important, but I couldn't visually tell the story. I could not tell the story. I couldn't, and I didn't want to sit there and there's already a ton of text in this show. I broke a lot of rules myself and I put a lot of text into this. And it felt like, you know, if I had one more sentence to this and it's not going to engage in the public, then it's a waste of space. It's a wasted opportunity.
Yeah, the focus of the movie and the exhibition is primarily the post-industrial pre-gentrification, you know, era, and that's kind of it's a lost and vanishing era. And part of what makes the history of that time interesting and valuable is that most of that goes unrecorded.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most of those activities are not the kind of things that were written about in the newspapers. It usually doesn't make it into the history books, as I say. It's, you know, pre-internet, so most of that stuff is hard to find. But on the other hand, you know, part of the hook of the movie, and as Jason is saying, you know, of the exhibition, is, you know, with these amazing stories, but they have to have some kind of corroborating evidence.
Yeah.
You know, so you know, it's a newspaper article, or it's, you know, flyers that we found, or it's artifacts. And as I say, this kind of these are kind of ephemeral activities, ephemeral, you know, and ephemera that we've collected to back them up. And it's some people who came to the exhibition or have seen the movie say, oh, you know, the trailers for the movie say, oh, this is our history. You know, this is, yeah, many buildings or buildings of this type, you know, have this distinguished industrial history. And they may or may not have this kind of crazy post-industrial history, but if they do, you know, as Gorman was pointing out, like, people don't know. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has been very rewarding about working on this, and then with, you know, myself, and then with Gorman and Jason, is it's brought together people, like each one of these chapters, as we sometimes call them, you know, many of them could be a movie in and of themselves, and most of them reflect some kind of a community that was there. So, you know, the Mime Troupe community, or the Paper Mache Video Institute artist community, or the R&B community, the punk rock community, the biker community. These were all gathering places for them, where they had these meaningful times and expressed this energy and creativity in their own way. And many of the people have come back together, you know, for the exhibition, or in the, you know, or in the interviews process for the movie, and you know, brought back memories, re-inspired activities, you know, and so that part's been great. So there is this, you know, very human aspect to all of these things, and we're recording, you know, living memory in most cases.
Absolutely, that's the key, is really this, and that's what, you know, really brought me into wanting to do this, is really that we're capturing that story, and we're capturing, again, you know, when I mentioned canon, the idea of it, it's like that. My view on history is that everybody's story is history, you know, and it all combines, and it's not there's the large picture that we're often taught in school, and it's the big, you know, so and so did this, whatever's the news caption of the day. But most of history is made up of the day-to-day activities, and it's relatable. And the more you look at it, it's these conversations that we're having. It's, you know, commuting to work, what have you, you know, it's feeding your kids. That makes up a lot of history. And in this instance, you know, you could look at this and you get that personal touch, and then people, you know, they want to come out and they want to share this. And it's wonderful because then, you know, things that you feel like, you know, may not have been important or no one's going to want to hear about, it turns out people are interested and they do want to hear about that. And at the same time, as we're working in the history business, we're able to then record that and add that to the city's history, the community's history, and broaden our sense of what we're talking about, which is basically a daily experience, at least in my view. You know, time.
Go ahead, Bill.
I just say one of the communities I want to make sure we, you know, don't leave out, you know, is the immigrant community of workers that used to live around the building. The building was the centerpiece of this, you know, ecosystem. You know, there wasn't zoning separation at that time, so people lived across the street. You know, and some of the people that we've found are people who grew up there. They're mostly, you know, in their 80s at this point, but again, they have these wonderful memories of growing up there. And they say, you know, we were poor, you know, classic, you know, immigrant stories. We were poor, but didn't know it. We lived in cold water flats with the bathroom down the hall, but it was like one big happy family. Everyone looked out for each other. And this family extended into the factory because they were all the same people.
Yeah.
And they said that the, you know, there was a major, you know, significant church next to the building called St. Patrick's that had a convent and a school. And so people who grew up there said to me multiple times, you know, we could live, you know, our whole lives on these blocks. We would be born here, go to church here, go to school here, and then work here. And then this building is sort of the sole survivor in its immediate neighborhood. It's surrounded by, you know, one-story, you know, 1960s and 70s industrial buildings. So it's an amazing survivor and this artifact that carries, it's the vessel for all of these feelings and stories that otherwise would be lost.
Yeah, and it creates a context for that area and, you know, a context for where it is today or where it can go. But yeah, it's really the built environment, and especially in a place like New Haven, you can look at the built environment, and it's something that we don't, on average, we don't appreciate, just because we don't have a sense of the story. This gives a distinct marker from which we could tell those different stories and kind of peel back the different layers of this really huge historical onion.
So I think also you could look at too, though, is to, you know, when you talk about not tearing down these buildings, is the potential that they hold. And I think the one example I'm going to give, because it's a building that is even larger than this, is the building that's now houses Mass Mocha, North Adams, Massachusetts, which was Sprague Electrical, closed up. The entire town basically went into the toilet. Everyone was out of work because I believe they hired something like 74% of the workers in town worked at this one plant.
Yeah.
But it has been turned around. I mean, now they've 250,000 square foot so far of museum space, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful example of that. You know, these buildings, their lives can continue.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, you know, adopting an old dog at a shelter. It's like, you know, you don't put it down yet. It's still got a lot of life in it and still can make you happy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's actually what I try to do, which is, you know, my view, and I think it's borne out by what Gorman is saying in many examples, other examples, is that these buildings can attract and create life. They can be catalysts for new life, new activity, in a way that it's very hard for a new building. Sometimes new buildings, you know, really great, you know, like Bilbao, you know, can do something like that. But, you know, the above average new building doesn't attract people in the same way to an area, particularly to an area that's, you know, way out of the way and sketchy and possibly dangerous. So, the Reed's building in downtown Bridgeport, for instance, which opened in 2003, downtown Bridgeport was empty, largely empty, largely, a lot of vacant buildings, nothing happening there. And over the 15 or so years since it's been opened, it's created, $400 or $500 million of development downtown and this ongoing renaissance, artistic, living, business, restaurant, and that's the kind of potential these buildings have, and that I'm hoping that the Clock Factory will have once, it's, if and when it's finally, redeveloped as artist live work housing and affordable housing.
Oh, we're coming up on an hour, and I think we've hit a lot of things. But before we kind of go, I think one of the things that kind of has been sticking in my head as we've been talking is that the building's still standing. And working in a museum, I think Jason knows this a lot, is that when we build our exhibits, they don't, once they're gone, we have the text, we may have the objects, but the actual exhibit or the emotion of the exhibit kind of gets lost. It's not protected in a lot of ways. And you've been working with Gorman on making these videos that we've been showcasing every week on keeping it alive. So how has that kind of mindset changed of like closing an exhibit and closing a chapter for you, but also now working on trying to keep it alive so it lives past its expiration, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. So, it goes back to the beginning of the conversation, this idea of kind of the show on ice. So there's still hope that, we'll open to a larger public again, and people will be able to catch it on the tail end and see it there. But yeah, part of this programming through this year was, again, when I said things were moving in a kind of fast forward pace, was, stepping up our capacity to engage people on different platforms and virtually, what have you. So we introduced, and I believe it came out in October, finally, Gorman and I started working on this over the summer, Factory Weekly, which basically is 10 episodes, just quick clips of the exhibit, like highlights from the exhibit, and to engage people who can't make it there, and kind of solve this issue too of, even in the best of times, you have to get in the car and come to New Haven. You got to get on a plane and come to New Haven. You got to, come in and during open hours, etc. Here, now you have the chance to take in this exhibit and take in, some of what we've put together and this history. And then also, like you said, it documents it and it keeps it in a different format. The fun part about the Factory Weeklies as well has been that, I said this when Gorman sent me the edits, or the first edits of the film clips. They bridged the gap that was in my mind of the film project, of standing in the place, to the exhibit. They're kind of like this last little piece in a puzzle for me there, because, I can't count how many nights I'd be up. It's like 2 a.m. and I'm sitting there at the keyboard, just like, I know what this wall looks like. I know when you walk down this hall, it's like this. But if you've never been in the place, how am I going to write this out? How am I going to show this? How am I going to feel this? And then, you watch one of the clips and there it is. You're walking up the hallway, or you get this little. So, it fulfills, again, it completes sort of the vision for it. And yeah, hopefully it allows people to experience it in a different way, hear firsthand from the people involved, often that we have all collectively interviewed. And, to some degree, I guess, yeah, overall it'll help provide sort of a way to, I guess, walk away from the project when the project's over. But I don't necessarily view that as happening with the show, and I don't really have that sole desire to. In the past, I've kind of I've always had a sort of creative mentality of, once I'm done with something, I'm done. And then like I move on, and like, you know, you have to focus on the next thing. That's definitely changing with time, and definitely with this show. You know, when you live and breathe and just really commit yourself to something, it's good to take a break, but you know, at the same time, that becomes part of you, and then it also shows up inevitably in the next things you do, no matter what. At least I view that, you know. So whatever next exhibit I may put together, or next article I may write, this experience clearly is going to show up in that project. And also, the with so many stories and so many people involved, there are still so many opportunities, and there's so much potential still to kind of build out each story. Because again, each little segment of the exhibit could almost be its own exhibit on itself.
A few of them especially. Yeah.
And people have come out of the woodwork in this whole process, and they're still, you know, again, we're learning new things. So yeah, there could be, you know, 5 years down the line, we could have the, you know, a whole new section that was just touched upon in this, you know, or again, sort of the B-sides, if you will, that didn't make the cut here. Well, hey, we're 5 years down the line, so that's even more historic, or we might have more perspective in the future. So it's fun, because this will continually grow and keep going. And with the film, with the development, it's something that's so much, it's still in process. And that's why I never really felt like a huge regret what was closing down, because it's all happening. It still is moving.
And if you were there watching, have stories about the factory, contact us, you know, either through, you know, the museum, or through What Were We Thinking Films, because we'd like to hear your stories.
Yeah, there should be an email at the end of the trailer. You're going to see the new trailer actually for the movie at the end of all of this. But a perfect example, Sydney, who is my editor, and she edited all the museum pieces and this new trailer. She finally got to go to the factory with me probably about a month and a half ago, I'd say it was, Bill, right? And you just let us in, and we went around and shot. I just wanted B-roll. We were running through the things just really fast, getting all this crazy footage of all the walls and stuff. She could not believe the size of the place. I mean, we're walking around, and she had no idea where she was in the buildings. This is just so massive. You know, I mean, I even went that day. I don't think I had ever been in the basement. You know, and that's a whole other, you know, it's like, you know.
And it's just, I think we cut that all out too. Yeah, we never touched the basement.
The basement is something else. It's like I'm swearing there are bodies all over the place in there.
Yeah. That's Tropical Retreat was there, and then La Dolce Vita. We don't have anybody from La Dolce Vita, and there was a firing range there apparently at one time. But you know, the building is just a fragment. You know, it's the oldest section is there, but you know, part of this section was torn down, and then a whole nother piece of the factory was across the street, connected by a sky bridge, which was torn down in the 60s. So
yeah. I mean, that's something to think about. I mean, the actual square footage of it, actually, I don't believe we've mentioned in this. Bill, what's the current square?
Well, right now it's about 150,000 feet. And it was probably 250 to 300,000 feet originally.
Just on that segment, and then across the way would have been another 300 double plus.
No. I mean together, both sides together was, I think, around that.
Right.
Well, maybe I'm wrong. It's more like 200,000 on this side, so maybe 400,000 altogether. I don't have actual measurements of the other one, but it was at least as big as this one. So in total, maybe 400,000.
Yeah. But that's all still there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the 150 is there. Yeah.
Right. But moving forward,
for the moment,
you know, it's there. It exists.
Yeah, Gorman sometimes says, the film may end with me, trying to block the wrecking ball from.
And that's how I picture the film ending a lot of times. Yes, like the same thing with you. My up in the middle of the night is like, how is this film end? Does it end with a nice groundbreaking and everyone's happy and the mayor's popping champagne and we're gonna have apartments here, or is it like this giant wrecking ball? And yeah, I do see I see Bill sort of like almost like the Miley Cyrus character, maybe not as attractive, holding on to the wrecking ball, trying to stop it trying to stop it from going into the building.
I don't think we could.
Either is possible. Either is possible at this point. There's a suspense to the movie.
There you go.
Yeah.
The wife.
I don't think we could end on a better note than that visual of Bill swinging the thing. Thank you,
like Miley. Yes.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And like we said, we're going to have the trailer premiere or the trailer at the end of this, and we're going to have links and information on where the documentary goes and Factory Weekly and the redevelopment. We're going to have links to everything. So please enjoy, reach out if you have stories, and thank you all for enjoying and watching.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I don't know of many buildings that have the past that this building has. Almost every doorway opens up into a new room, into a new story.
It was our CBGBs. Place went nuts. The word got around. You couldn't beat them off here with a stick.
This was the place to go. There was always a party here. It was always a party.
This was one of my first experiences with oddball art.
He went from making 100 clocks or so in a year to making thousands of clocks.
Getting into the building was exciting, and not knowing whether we'd survive the party was exciting too.
This is the crown jewel.
By the time we got in, the parrot actually froze.
I said, you know what? Let's put a swimming pool right outside the dressing room.
I actually squatted, like, no one knew I was here.
Creating space and creating your own stuff, fantastic.
Ah, the G.G. Allen Show.
G.G. Allen.
G.G. Allen.
G.G. Allen.
What is this?
It was the hottest place in New Haven at the time.
I think buildings like this are what creative legacy is made of.
That's what I thought of when I first saw it, and I said that I think I found a castle in New Haven.